Communion is a word most Catholics know. Usually we think of it in terms of the Eucharist, Holy Communion. Communio is a term most Catholics know less well, if at all, and yet the word communio is the word from which our word communion comes. It is at the heart of the mystery of God and at the heart of the mystery of the Church. It's also a term used to describe a certain group of Catholic theologians and their approach to theology. And for our purposes today, Communio refers to a theological journal associated with those theologians and their approach. That journal, founded 1973, marks its 50th anniversary this year. I guess that would be 1972. That's right, 1972. To celebrate that anniversary, St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry in Rochester, New York, is hosting a sort of massive birthday party of sorts, a conference with some of today's leading Communio theologians and thinkers. To discuss this birthday bash, we have several of the conference organizers, Lisa Lacona, Daniel Drain, and Matthew Cooner from St. Bernard's. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you aboard. After my lengthy introduction, Carl, I thought I'd shut up for a little bit and let you grill our guests.
Well, hopefully my connection here is going to stay good. It's great to be with you guys. The Communio resource theologians really had a great impact on me and my journey to becoming a Catholic, entering the Catholic Church. And but like Mark said, a lot of people don't have a really good idea about what Communio is. So maybe a couple of you or all of you could talk a little bit about the Communio movement, the journal, and why, really what it sought to do. We can dig into that a little bit deeper, some of the specifics, but what has been the general purpose of the Communio journal and movement over these last 5 decades?
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having us, Mark and Carl. It's a real gift to be here as we begin, and we're sort of in the advanced stages of planning this birthday bash. And so if everyone could say a prayer that it goes well, and that the cake arrives on time, et cetera, that would be lovely. But, to your question, and I think we all have different answers, so I'll sort of try to keep it sort of contracted from my own piece. But, one of the things that really, really comes out in some of the founding documents, and that's what I would recommend at the outset, is for anyone that wants to learn a little bit more about the sort of Communio approach to theology, but then also the journal itself, founded in 1972, principally by Urs von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, and Joseph Ratzinger, among many others, is really sort of take a look at those founding documents. Ratzinger has an article on the founding of Communio. Balthasar has an article on the founding of Communio. And then Balthasar also has a mission document that he wrote some years later, which are really lovely. And a lot of those are collected in the fall 1992 edition of the Communio Journal, the English language edition. But, if I could, I just wanted to read maybe the sort of, again, the condensed identification of the mission of Communio. And this is Balthasar writing in 78, 79. And here's what he says. He says, Communio intends, firstly, negatively, to fight at all costs against the deadly polarization brought on by the fervor displayed by traditionalists and modernists alike, and then positively, to perceive of the Church as a central communio, a community that originated from communion with Christ, who presented himself as a gift to the Church, as a communio that will enable us to share our hearts, thoughts, and blessings. And I really love, maybe just to dwell with that first point for a second, is this notion that the true communio of the Church actually transcends polarization, right? The polarization of political categories. So I think there really is an attempt to sort of recover the Church as something that is gifted to us, that is a whole, that is something greater than ourselves, and even that is transpolitical in terms of our categories. So the language of the sort of tendencies of modernism, the tendencies of traditionalism, both don't do true justice to the multiplicity in unity of the body of Christ, but also to the very contours of the deposit of faith itself. And so really, when we think about Communio as an approach to theology, there's always an approach of returning to the source. And that source is precisely the gift that's given in the person of Jesus Christ, but the very gift of the Father's heart. I mean, in that sense, the gift of Trinitarian communion. So let me I'll stop there, though. Pass it off.
Good to hear from others. Any comments on that? I mean, you can correct Matthew if you like. Your opportunity.
I'll take that up. I won't correct you, but that was a great, beautiful answer, Matthew. That's such a beautiful question that you're posing to us about communio, and I loved what you were saying at the beginning, Mark, about this being a term that a lot of it may even sound a little foreign to some Catholics, even today, even though it's become very much part of the parlance of theology, especially since the Second Vatican Council. And I suppose I would only add there that a couple of points. One is that the journal Communio was born 50 years ago, really as a friendship, a communion between some really important figures. I mean, these are people that we do know through your work at Ignatius Press. Thanks be to God. And in particular, Urs von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, and Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, and what these and you know we could add a lot of names to that. Actually, there were a lot of other people involved in the founding of Communio, and maybe we would even add Pope John Paul II as someone who wasn't directly related to the journal, but who was very much attached to, or I would say related to, this school of theology. And the Communio approach really was, or Communio arose out of this desire to really enter deeply into what was being proposed at the Second Vatican Council, which is that the Church, in this moment in history, had to come to a deeper understanding of her relationship to the world. How can we really, draw all men into unity, which is Christ's prayer, of course, for all of us. So if we want to think about the concept of Communio, I think one way to think about it is the unity that God himself is, right? God is one and three. He's triune. That life of love, which is God's own life, is something in which we as a church are meant to propose to the world. So we're sent out on mission. And the beauty of the journal, I think, was to really the desire to grapple with this in all its dimensions. What does it mean for the church to turn toward the world, but with this desire, like you were saying, Matthew, which was so beautiful, beginning first from the person of Jesus Christ as a revelation of the Trinity. So there's this way of bringing theology and life together in the pages of Communio that is impacted a lot of us. And I think the journal itself has impacted so many people. Maybe they don't even realize it because they are followers in some way of the writings of Ratzinger, de Lubac, or Balthasar, or any of these figures, and perhaps without even knowing their role in founding this journal.
Very good. Well, Daniel, now you are in the interesting position of being able to correct both Matthew and Lisa.
No, in fact, I think I can only say something lame following after them, which is the usual order here. I think I'd like to come back to the idea that Communio comes out of the Second Vatican Council in some sense. And I don't want to overreach with historical claims there, but if I might read just a selection from another text from Urs von Balthasar, but this is his Raising the Bastions, which was his sort of firebrand text from 1952 that many were upset about and saw as prophetic with respect to the council. And I want to link that to the aims of the council, and I'll do that in a moment. But let me just read this passage, because I think this younger Balthasar in 1952 is reflected quite well in those mission documents that Matthew read from. So Balthasar says this: there are two means of retaining or renewing the vitality of a historical construction for the present and the future. The first is violent and comes from outside, namely the destruction of the tradition, of the monuments and libraries, the archives and administrative bodies, perhaps the dissolution of the historical memory for generations, and consequently the necessity to begin afresh with a tabula rasa. The second is intellectual and comes from within, namely the power of transcending. This is the vitality that is the lifeblood of all traditions, the vitality that knows the past and yet is able to separate itself from the past to the extent that this is required by responsibility and readiness for the future. Both means can be grace. The second, a radiant grace, the first, a harsh grace. And then just to skip ahead a little bit in this section. The second demanding difficult path is that of transcendence from within. In contrast to the spiritually explosive power of bombs, this second way contributes the spiritually explosive power of holiness, which is always something more than the wisdom of the tradition. It is the presence of the Holy Spirit for us in today's age, which, I mean, I think that can just be sort of mic dropped in some sense, but let me link it with John the 23rd in his opening address to the council. This is where he's describing in particular the fresh approach, the sort of opening of the windows, the adjournamento of the council. He writes, "There is no need to call a council merely to hold discussions of that nature, of dogmatic nature. What is needed at the present time is a new enthusiasm, a new joy and serenity of mind in the unreserved acceptance by all of the entire Christian faith, without forfeiting that accuracy and precision in its presentation which characterized the proceedings of the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council." And this is what I love. What is needed, and what everyone imbued with a truly Christian, Catholic, and apostolic spirit craves today, is that this doctrine shall be more widely known, more deeply understood, and more penetrating in its effects on men's moral lives. What is needed is that this certain and immutable doctrine, to which the faithful owe obedience, be studied afresh and reformulated in contemporary terms. For this deposit of faith, or truths which are contained in our time-honored teaching, is one thing. The manner in which these truths are set forth, with their meaning preserved intact, is something else. I mean, what I see over and over again in the pages of Communio is this idea of setting off the explosive power of holiness. And whether that's reflected through issues on metaphysics, whether that's reflected in the sort of Retrieving the Tradition series that's present there, what's operative here is unfolding what the council means and doesn't mean by the universal call to holiness, which is that the laity can absolutely set the world on fire from the heart of the church. And that's Communio, if I could just say that.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Thanks for all of you for that. Anytime I hear von Balthasar, quoted, I think of people who, the misunderstandings of him and so forth, and we don't need to get into that here, but I encourage so many people over the years, if you have questions about, read him. And the wonderful thing about von Balthasar, to make a quick point here from a perspective of a non-academic, is he wrote so many books that are so accessible, which is, I think, really, it's not necessarily totally unique, but somewhat unique among, like the great theologians, but really some wonderful, penetrating, accessible. I'm thinking of his book, for laymen. I forget the full title of that, but Present Concerns or whatever it is. But he's very devastating. He's very quotable. Maybe more so than maybe de Lubac, who I consider to be the master of footnotes. I wanted to segue from those great.
Well, now you read de Lubac's paradoxes and more paradoxes. So you've got.
Well, true, and I have. Sometimes in reading de Lubac, I actually learn more in the footnotes than I do from the main text. I want to segue from that, and what I love about all those answers is there's a deeply Trinitarian, Christocentric focus, which I really always think about when I think about the Communio approach, and then it's always oriented towards entering into the divine life and being made holy and participating in God's divine life in order to be holy. And so I want to segue from that to the title of the conference you're having, Catholicity as Gift and Task. And just kind of an open question, what are some ways in which that title, Catholicity as Gift and Task, is going to be articulated? Who are some of the folks who are going to be presenting, the focus of some of the talks, to kind of bring that to those who participate?
It's beautiful. I can lead off if we're going through the roster again. It's been lovely to actually see the response, and I would love for the listeners and the viewers to check out the St. Bernard's website. You can sort of see the page for the conference, Catholicity as Gift and Task. And you can see not only the keynote speakers who are just legends with regard to Communio, the Communio approach to theology, but also all of the breakout session speakers that we have, because we received such an overwhelming response. It's such a gift to host all these people. And I think one of the things that's really interesting
So
is...
Matthew, I'm going to ask you to just tell us a little bit how people can go find that information.
Sure.
Didn't mean to interrupt you there, but that'd be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, if you Google stbernards.edu as well as Communio conference, you'll find it pretty quickly. It's up there. Or you can go to stbernards.edu and you can go on our website. It's right on the splash page there on the front if you scroll down. So you'll be able to find that pretty easily. You'll find a lot more information about how to register, things like that, the details of the conference.
So
It's
people can actually descend on Rochester, but
Precisely.
if for some reason, they're not able to fly in that weekend, people can also participate online.
We're trying to add the charm of upstate New York during fall as a sort of attraction to come in person. But yes, indeed, the whole conference, except for the prayer and the meals, will also be able to be seen via Zoom. So that's something that we offer as well.
Excellent.
And the price points reflect the difference in participation. So there is a much lesser price point for attending via Zoom. But that's a big question that the founders of Communio have tried to ask, is what does Catholicity mean? And this is all by way of answering the question about the speakers. One of the things that Catholicity means, I think, is that they were suggesting that in the post-conciliar age, there are just a ton of opinions, of perspectives, of ideas being all thrown together, both within the church and outside the church. And the confusion that results from that when it comes to the faithful is not a situation that they were okay with just leaving be, right? So that's part of the whole purpose of the Communio Journal, and the approach is actually to give, as you were saying, Carl, with Balthasar's books for just the layman, right? To give some direction to the common person in the pew, right? Someone without a theology degree, what is going on with all of these thoughts and ideas and things like that. And actually, Catholicity is directly how they envision the sort of hermeneutic for what they're doing there, because they think that the Catholicity of the church means that those in the church have a new responsibility for the whole. Isn't that interesting? Because katholikos, right, means the whole, as it were, or at least with reference to the whole kataholon. And so there's a responsibility for the whole that all Catholics have. And that means even ideas that aren't distinctively theological or philosophical, right? There's a responsibility for the whole of culture as well, all of the things that go into culture. So I think when it comes to that, that's reflected actually in the very speakers that we have. We've got philosophy and theology, as you would expect. We've got a ton of other sort of cultural commentary pieces. We've got a couple pieces on the sex abuse crisis coming in, where the church is at right now. We've got some sort of political theological pieces, as well as we've even got a paper on communio homiletics, right? So sort of aspects of ministry also. So you sort of see that the very speakers reflect a responsibility for the whole that I think runs throughout all the Communio thinkers, as well as the pages of the journal itself. And so let me say, one of the ways that we've also reflected that Catholicity is the very internationality of the keynote speakers, also at a more basic level, because Catholicity doesn't just mean responsibility for the whole in the sense of ideas and currents and culture, but also the world, right? The actual geographical extent of the world. And so we have Jean-Luc Marion and Jean Duchesne, two of the founding members of the French edition of Communio, coming to us from Paris. We have Jacques Servet, Father Jacques Servet, Jesuit, who is the rector of the Castle Balthasar in Rome. And then we also have Tracy Rowland coming from Australia. So you sort of have this international presencing. And then we have, of course, members of the editorial board for the English-speaking edition of Communio also. So we have all of those people converging. So the sort of unity of the church is here, but in its multiplicity as a gathering of the whole.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned there's a lot that you said there, and also in your opening comments that bears exploration. This emphasis on the Second Vatican Council I find interesting. As you know, there's a lot of second guessing would be an understatement. I don't know how many guessings we are beyond the second guessing at this point, but multiple reconsiderations of the Second Vatican Council. Here we are, post 50 years after the council, and it's still fairly common. Perhaps you could say it's more common today than perhaps 10, 20 years ago, to hear it said that Vatican II happened, and then in the years after Vatican II, confusion reigned. And the presumption in that kind of description is, first of all, that all we had was confusion in post-conciliar period, which is not accurate. But even to the extent we did have confusion, what's presumed in that observation is that not only that the Second Vatican Council is responsible for the confusion, but in the absence of the Second Vatican Council, we would have had a serene church where everything would have been fine. We would have sailed through the 1960s and the 1970s without, a qualm or a concern, and the churches would be full and the mission of the church would be thriving. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know it's a counterfactual to kind of go into, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore. How do you see that? And all of you feel free to comment. And in light of Communio theology and the objectives of those in this approach to theology, when they articulated the vision of the Second Vatican Council.
Maybe I'll jump in with that. That's actually a really interesting question, and I think it can be actually answered without polemics, but from the heart of theology, because that idea of Catholicity, it isn't just geographical, it's also historical, right? And that was something that came out of the council that was so exciting and beautiful for all of us, was this idea of ressourcement, right? This idea that we have this vast tradition, and theology in particular had gotten stuck in certain ways and wasn't going back and really drawing on the fathers of the church, on the saints, on this incredible richness that we have. And when you go back and do that kind of deep dive into the history of the church, and that's something we've seen in the pages of Communio the whole way through, what you start to realize is that crises are part of the church. We go through moments. There's been a lot of moments in church history that have been challenging, right? So it gives us a kind of that perspective that comes from history, that okay, we don't want to just stay where we are in kind of our own little bubble here, but see this in a broader sense. But when you start to do that deep dive, at the same time, the resources of our own tradition start to speak to our moment. And I think that's one of the things that we really need. We need to keep returning to. Balthasar was a great one. I said this in another interview. I got so much out of reading what he said about Maximus the Confessor, who, of course, he wrote a whole book on Maximus the Confessor, on his theology. But Maximus the Confessor lived at a time when orthodoxy was paid for. He had his tongue cut out and his hand cut off because he was defending the church. And this is a fact that we are called to live in this, way of giving ourselves totally for this truth. And that's a beautiful thing. But also it's a fact that these dynamics come, and that what is happening in that moment is a call to us to live in this more intense way. So that brings us back to Balthasar's whole theology. A lot of what attracts a lot of people to Balthasar is his intense understanding of what it is to live a life of holiness, right? That it's a gift of self. It's a total thrust of yourself into this calling that God has given. And so in a way, that's what the moment calls for, is this response of ourselves, more than just a pure, talking heads politicizing. And I'm gonna hand this on to Danny, because he's doing a course on Vatican II right now, so he's probably really should be correcting us.
All right.
Yeah, I suppose just one main thing to say, it's that the way that Revelation seems to work is not, as it were, gradually, but everything being given all at once, right? The resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection were absolutely not understood in the moment. But the whole thing happened, and then we had to kind of deal with it. And that took time, and that time involved misunderstanding, understanding, suffering for the sake of the faith, and so on. And I think from that sort of bird's eye historical perspective, 50 years after an ecumenical council, we're really only apt now for receiving it. Now, that being said, I think, of course, that you can read the pontificates of John Paul II and of Benedict XVI and of Francis as a reception of the council and read those things ecclesially. But a general recognition that, I mean, the sort of density of what's dropped when the church issues constitutions and dogmatic constitutions at that is precisely something that has to be unfolded and lived through a few generations until it sort of settles into this sober point of a firmer foundation. Like now these things are turning into bedrock. And I think that's partially what's happening. So on the one hand, you can be tremendously discouraged by all of the lack of clarity and wherever you might be seeing that. But on the other hand, the task of interpretation is just as fresh and perhaps even actually a little bit simpler now because we've seen extreme vacillations to either side, right? To a rigorous on one side and a laxity on the other. And I think now is the sober point of what did John Paul II see as the firm thread from Gaudium et Spes 22, Gaudium et Spes 24? How does Pope Francis live that now, and so on? I think now is the moment for interpretation, and that's sort of a feature of the thing and not a bug. Yeah, if I might say it so generously. That's a generous reading of the state of the church, I suppose. Yeah.
Matthew, I'd like to get your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, like, what would be a ressourcement response to this situation? And I guess for me, the point would always be to sort of hit on aspects of Lisa's and Daniel's points. I mean, we have to be reading the conciliar texts. We have to be reading them. This is an ecumenical council of the church, right? I mean, this is the Holy Spirit speaking in our age, in the 20th century, the heart of the 20th century. We need to be reading the text. I think we also need to, in some sense, become friends with the saints that were living at that time. So read John the 23rd's opening address that Daniel was citing. Read that. I know it's hard to get. I know it's in Bishop Barron's compilation of Vatican II documents. So he did a real service by providing that on a broader scale, right? But read that opening address because it's so insightful hermeneutically to understand what was going on at the time. And become friends with those who lived through the 50s and had some insight into the crises that were present precisely then. Because we can't just start with the council either. Like, it's good to know what were some of the crises that were being faced and that Balthasar was identifying in 1952 and raising the bastions, for example. And I really love the argument that many make. I think Larry Chapp makes it somewhat frequently, this notion that, look, the confusion that happened in the post-conciliar age could not have come upon us overnight if there wasn't some crisis happening at the heart of the church prior to the council and even during the, you see what I mean, right? So in some sense, the council can be seen as a very, prophetic act in that sense to sort of respond to a crisis in the midst of it, as it were. So I think the response would be to go back, not only just read the texts, but actually get to know the folks that lived through it, right? The saints and the doctors that were living at that age. Befriend them, get to know their concerns instead of just generalizing and sort of making totalizing arguments in that sense.
Oftentimes when I think about the post-conciliar period and the different reactions to the council, I think of the parable of the sower. And you're looking at what kind of soil we had in the pre-conciliar era towards the end, that received, as it were, the word, and what happened as a result of that. We had different reactions. Now there's a lot of it's sort of a contest over whether we should have had the council, how to interpret the council, and all of that. But the fundamental question of what was the council about oftentimes gets obscured, and you get these debates about various fine points of liturgy or whatever, but that fundamental going back to the sources in Scripture, in the liturgy, what's the term to use? A restored sense of the spiritual life and the universal call to holiness. Oftentimes that gets overlooked in the conversation. Anyway, I don't want to dominate. I don't know, Carl, if you want to weigh in here. We don't want to lose sight of the fact we're also talking about your conference and Communio, which, by the way, there's a little bit of, with respect to the journal, it is not unusual to describe it as a sort of a counterbalance, whether that term's a fair one or not, to another theological publication or journal that emerged in the post-conciliar era, Concilium. Can anybody talk a little bit about that? Because that, in some ways, expresses in theological journal form this a significant measure of the what shall we say, conversation, if not debate, in the Vatican II era, and to some extent, it remains part of the discussion today.
Amen. That's so beautiful. And, you know, and I think that's exactly right, that Communio, historically, the circumstances of its founding were such that it was in marked distinction to the Concilium journal, which was founded much earlier as the sort of, as it were, the journal of interpretation of the council. I mean, that was sort of the idea that we can sort of
Right.
keep the periti, the theologians that were at the council, we can keep this brain trust somewhat together and actually allow it to work out the interpretation, the effect, the purposes of the council in the years afterwards. So it's really instructive, right? Many, if not most, of the founders and authors in Communio were in some way related to Concilium, you know, many, if not most. And I think with Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, you sort of see the shift where, you know, from the moment that he was a founder of Communio, he stopped with Concilium, right? So you sort of see him as this sort of shifting figure at that point. I think I heard that Karl Lehmann was the only one who actually sustained both participation in both journals at the same time for years afterwards.
I think that's correct. Of course, de Lubac very early on, you know, he was part of that Concilium group, but he was concerned and discerned early on a trajectory that would become problematic. But yeah, sure. I don't know if others have any comment about that.
Exactly. And you know, so what's interesting is I think in terms of my own attempt to like live the Communio approach to theology or whatever, I try to not so much deny the historical reality of the founding of Communio in juxtaposition to Concilium, while also in a certain sense realizing that the mission documents of Communio and what you see in their pages is much larger than sort of the fraught relationship with Concilium, in the sense that they think, in other words, it seems to me, and I'm sort of putting words in their mouth maybe a little bit, but it seems like they think that the problems that they were seeing in Concilium are actually symptomatic of a larger problem of, as it were, losing the vision and the vision of the whole, and frankly, the contact with the source, right? The Trinitarian source of ecclesial communion. And I think when you lose that, that's when you sort of, perhaps the whole can be denigrated into factional, sectarian violence, as it were, right? To use Ratzinger's word, Daniel. And, you know, and in that sense, that's perhaps what causes damage, right, to the church and God's little ones, right, in the parishes, in their prayer life, so on and so forth. When the leaders in the church lose the vision of the whole and the contact with the source, and the confusion and the sort of factions get sunken down to the level of the parishes and the celebration of the liturgy, then you begin to see sort of this massive effect. And I think that's the point, is in a certain sense, this is Balthasar in the Mission again. He says, Communio does not present the mysteries of our faith as intellectual riddles for specialists. Communio does not treat theology as a purely academic subject. All the Communio wishes to accomplish is merely to help clarify the issues that confront the contemporary Christian by utilizing the shining depths of our common faith, and in so doing, to counteract widespread feelings of uncertainty. Isn't that beautiful, right? The shining depths, as it were.
So there in that there is obviously a touch point with respect to fidelity to tradition, all the things that go into you know, the controversies of the age and so on. And on one side of it, on the other side of it, responsiveness to what's going on in the world around us and so on. But it's not a reactionary agenda, neither in terms of reacting to the modern world or reacting to what the perception of the abandonment of tradition, so on. That's one of the things I love about Communio. It is a going back to the sources and a renewal and refreshment of the theological spiritual vision. And of course, because it's a theology journal, it's obviously not written for the average person in the pew, but it is written in such a way as to eventually have an impact on that. That's what I love about it. other folks, tell us a little bit more about what you hope to accomplish from this conference with respect to the journal Communio.
I'll just say, because I really loved your comment just now, Matthew. I really think that for us, what we're talking about right now, this kind of Communio being formed in this kind of still center, it wasn't just a reaction, right? It was an attempt to discover the heart of theology. It really is something that seems to kind of run through our conversations here at St. Bernard's a lot. I think one thing that's really beautiful for us is that we have the opportunity to have this conference, and all three of us have been significantly formed by the journal itself, by people that write in Communio frequently. My theological mentor was David L. Schindler, who has been the editor for years and years. And I think that one aspect of what we want to get out of this conference is just to share a conversation that we have here every day at St. Bernard's, and let that conversation be opened up. So that's like, just on the pure personal level. And to me, it really tracks with the whole idea of Communio as the journal was founded. There's these stories about these guys just getting together and having conversations at the coffee shop, and hey, we gotta found a journal. And so in a way, I guess like that on that purely personal level, but that is the heart of our faith, right? Our faith is alive. We're living in the flesh, right? We're living in the real world. And so, so I guess in that way, I'm making a theological point too, is that, we're not that, academic pieces shouldn't be abstractions. They shouldn't be something floating in the ether, right? They should have a trajectory. They should draw on our experience, and they should really end up informing our experience. And, here I just think of that, what I think is probably for all of us, the magisterial essay, Theology and Sanctity, that Balthasar had in Explorations in Theology, Volume 1. I'm for my paper at the conference, I'm rereading that and working on that, because this whole idea of a unity of life and knowledge, right? So it's not just we're doing something abstract in our little ivy tower, our little conversation, which is going on between theologians, but we really want to be drawing on our own lives, and we want what we do to be impacting other people's lives. So it's our goal is not to become theologians as much as saints, and saints, as Balthasar says, are the real theologians. So I guess I would just say that this is, for us, it's a very exciting thing. I mean, this has been, we just met together at a coffee shop to discuss this interview, and the energy is so palpable. And I hope that that's going to be what we have here. I think it's what we're going to have, a birthday party and a super exciting conversation.
Good, excellent. Well, I hope you share the cake with everybody. Well, thank you all. We could talk at much greater length about this, but we want people to actually attend the conference, participate in the conference, read the journal, of course, subscribe to the journal, read it, but also participate in the conference either in person or via the internet. I'm going to ask Dr. Kuhner to give us once again how that can happen before we close out here.
stbernards.edu is our website, and you'll be able to find us on there. You can also just Google St. Bernard's Communio Conference 2022. By the way, the dates are September 30th to October 2nd, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We have a keynote presentation every day, and then we have breakout sessions throughout, and it will culminate in a panel of all of the keynotes together. So that'll be a really memorable sight to have all the keynotes sitting together, responding to one another, as well as questions from those that are attending. And it's really worth mentioning that it would not be a conference in celebration of Communio if we did not actually both have Communio with one another. So we have extended spaces between for conversations in hallways, for meal times, for snack times, so on and so forth. There will be cocktail hours as well. But then finally, also communion with the Lord, right? So we have a good bit of prayer. We do candlelit Compline every night of the conference, which is a highlight of our academic conferences. People have referred to them as intellectual retreats, which is one of the proudest things I think that anyone could say about our conferences. So praise God. But again, it's feel free to jump on our website, check it out. All the information that's necessary is there. And I'd love to send some links along to you, Mark and Carl, to put in the show notes or whatever else of the various places that this will be posted.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Matthew Kuhner, Daniel Drain, and Lisa Lacona. We appreciate you talking about the 50th anniversary of the founding of the journal Communio, your conference at St. Bernard's, and Communio theology in general. And thank you, Carl, for joining me on this.
Oh, my pleasure. It's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. God bless you.